The muddy waters of the Missouri River churned beneath the cliff where Elizabeth Blackwood stood, her tear-stained face illuminated by the setting sun. The wind whipped her chestnut hair around her pale face as she stared down at the swirling current. 3 months ago, she'd had everything: a loving husband, a promising future, and the respect of everyone in Redemption Falls. Now she had nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart shattered beyond repair. Behind her, the small frontier town carried on with its evening rituals, unaware of the widow's desperate intentions at the river's edge. The saloon piano tinkled faintly in the distance, a cruel reminder of happier times when she and Thomas would dance on Saturday nights, his strong arms guiding her across the rough wooden floor. Elizabeth closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped forward into empty space. Sheriff Mason Reeves had just finished his evening rounds when he spotted a figure on the cliff overlooking the river. Something about the silhouette against the crimson sky set off warning bells in his weathered mind. At 45, Mason had seen enough death to recognize its invitation when he saw it. Without hesitation, he spurred his dappled gray stallion toward the cliff, his heart pounding beneath his worn leather vest. 20 years as a lawman had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being screamed that someone was about to make a terrible mistake. As he drew closer, he recognized Elizabeth Blackwood, the young widow whose husband had been gunned down by the Delaney gang while defending the town bank. Mason had been too late to save Thomas Blackwood that day, a failure that still haunted his dreams. He wouldn't be too late again. Hey there, friends. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? Now back to our tale of the Old West. The sheriff dismounted in a cloud of dust and ran the last 50 yards on foot, his spurs jingling with each desperate stride. He reached the cliff's edge just in time to see Elizabeth's body disappear over the edge. Without thinking, Mason threw off his gun belt and hat and dove after her, slicing through the air like an arrow. The cold water hit him like 1,000 knives, driving the air from his lungs as the current immediately began to pull at his clothes. Through the murky water, he caught a glimpse of Elizabeth's dress, her body limp as the river claimed her. With powerful strokes, Mason fought against the current, his muscles burning with effort as he closed the distance between them. His lungs screamed for air as his fingers finally caught the fabric of her dress, pulling her toward him in the swirling darkness. Breaking the surface with a desperate gasp, Mason pulled Elizabeth's head above water, her face pale and lifeless in the fading light. The current threatened to drag them both down as he struggled toward the shore, one arm wrapped tightly around the unconscious woman. "Don't you die on me!" he growled through clenched teeth, fighting the river's pull with every ounce of strength he possessed. By the time his boots found purchase on the muddy riverbank, his arms felt like lead and his chest heaved with exhaustion. He dragged Elizabeth onto dry land and immediately pressed his ear to her chest, praying for the sound of a heartbeat beneath her sodden clothes. The faint flutter he felt sent a wave of relief through his tired body, but she wasn't breathing. Acting on instinct, Mason turned her onto her side and firmly struck her back, willing the river water to leave her lungs. When Elizabeth finally coughed and sputtered, expelling water from her lungs in painful heaves, Mason cradled her head in his calloused hands. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion quickly giving way to disappointment as she realized what had happened. She was still alive. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Why couldn't you just let me go?" Mason's weathered face hardened as he looked down at her. Raindrops from his soaked hair falling onto her cheeks like tears. "Because you're not done living yet, Mrs. Blackwood," he said firmly, his voice low and determined. Then, his expression softening slightly, he leaned closer and whispered, "You're mine to save, whether you like it or not." Something in his tone, not pity, but a deep understanding, made Elizabeth turn her face away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. The walk back to town was silent, save for the squelch of their wet boots and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Elizabeth, wrapped in Mason's duster coat, shivered despite the warm evening air. The sheriff had insisted on carrying her for the first mile, ignoring her weak protests until her strength returned enough to walk on her own. Now they trudged side by side, following the river's edge, back toward the twinkling lights of Redemption Falls. Neither spoke of what had happened, what she had tried to do, and what he had prevented. Instead, Mason occasionally pointed out constellations appearing in the darkening sky, his deep voice rumbling about ancient hunters and bears dancing among the stars. Elizabeth listened without comment, too exhausted to argue and too broken to care about myths and legends. All she knew was that death had rejected her today, and she didn't know whether to feel grateful or cheated. The Golden Nugget Saloon was in full swing when Mason and Elizabeth passed by on their way to the doctor's house. Through the swinging doors came the sounds of raucous laughter, tinkling piano keys, and the clink of glasses. A group of cowboys, fresh off a cattle drive, were celebrating their pay, while professional gamblers worked the poker tables with expressionless faces and nimble fingers. None of them spared a glance for the bedraggled sheriff and the widow as they passed by. Elizabeth kept her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to bear the thought of curious stares and whispered gossip. Mason's steady presence beside her was both a comfort and a reminder of her failure. When they reached Doc Wilson's small house at the edge of town, the sheriff knocked firmly on the door, his other hand resting protectively on Elizabeth's shoulder. "He won't ask questions," Mason assured her quietly. "Not tonight, anyway." Doc Wilson was a veteran of the Civil War who had seen too much death to be easily surprised by anything. He took one look at Elizabeth's soaked dress and hollow eyes and ushered them inside without a word. His wife, Martha, a plump woman with kind eyes, immediately took charge of the young widow, leading her away to change into dry clothes while shooting concerned glances at the sheriff. Mason declined the offer of whiskey with a shake of his head, instead accepting a cup of strong coffee that warmed his hands as much as his insides. "She tried to drown herself," he said simply when they were alone, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the back room where Elizabeth was changing. "Thomas's death broke something in her." The doctor nodded gravely, stroking his gray beard. "Some wounds don't bleed, Sheriff. Doesn't make them any less deadly." Later that night, after Martha had insisted Elizabeth take their spare bedroom and Doc Wilson had checked her for fever, Mason sat alone on the doctor's porch, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and staring into the darkness. The events at the river played over and over in his mind. Her pale face as he pulled her from the water, the disappointment in her eyes when she realized she was still alive. He knew that look all too well. After his wife and daughter had died of influenza 15 years ago, he'd stood on a similar cliff, staring down at churning waters and contemplating the peace they might bring. Only the timely arrival of his former commander from the war had stopped him from taking that final step. Colonel Harrison had given him purpose when he needed it most, convincing him to pin on a badge and channel his pain into protecting others. Now Mason wondered if he could do the same for Elizabeth, give her a reason to keep living when all she wanted was to escape her pain. Inside the Wilson home, Elizabeth lay awake beneath a patchwork quilt, listening to the distant sounds of a town settling down for the night. The saloon piano had finally fallen silent, replaced by the occasional barking of dogs and the whisper of wind through cottonwood trees. Her body ached from the ordeal in the river, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight in her chest that made each breath a conscious effort. Thomas's face haunted her whenever she closed her eyes, his kind smile, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. The way his strong hands had held hers as he bled out on the bank floor. "I'll always protect you," he had promised on their wedding day, 2 years ago. Now he was gone, buried on the hillside overlooking their small homestead, and she was left alone in a world that suddenly seemed too large and too cruel. The sheriff had saved her body from the river today, but Elizabeth wondered if anyone could save what remained of her soul. Dawn broke over Redemption Falls in a blaze of pink and gold, the sun's first rays illuminating the false fronts of the Main Street businesses. Mason Reeves, who had spent the night in a chair on Doc Wilson's porch, stood and stretched his stiff muscles, wincing as his spine popped in protest. He'd sent word to his deputy the night before to handle the morning rounds, knowing that Elizabeth Blackwood needed watching more than the town did. As if summoned by his thoughts, the door opened behind him, and Elizabeth stepped out, dressed in a simple blue dress borrowed from Martha Wilson. Her face was pale but composed, her hair neatly braided down her back. For a moment, they regarded each other in silence, the events of the previous evening hanging between them like a physical presence. "You didn't have to stay," she finally said, her voice stronger than it had been at the river. Mason shrugged, settling his hat on his head. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked as they walked down the main street, the town just beginning to stir around them. Shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery. Mason considered her question carefully before answering. "That depends on you, Mrs. Blackwood. I could pretend yesterday never happened, or—" He paused, measuring his next words. "Or I could help you find a reason to stay on this side of the river." Elizabeth's steps faltered slightly. She hadn't expected understanding from the stern lawman, only judgment or pity. "Why would you bother?" she asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You barely know me." Mason stopped and turned to face her, his gray eyes serious beneath the brim of his hat. "I know enough. I know grief can make a person blind to everything but pain. I know what it's like to want the world to stop turning because someone you love isn't in it anymore." The raw honesty in his voice surprised her into silence. As they approached the small sheriff's office, Deputy Jim Parker emerged, his young face lighting up at the sight of his boss. "Sheriff, was just about to come looking for you. Got a telegram from Cheyenne last night." He handed Mason a folded piece of paper, his eyes darting curiously to Elizabeth before quickly looking away. Mason read the telegram, his expression darkening with each word. "The Delaney gang was spotted near Bear Creek, heading this way," he said grimly, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "Seems they've got unfinished business in Redemption Falls." Elizabeth felt a chill run through her body at the mention of the men who had murdered her husband. For the first time since Thomas's death, something other than grief flared in her chest, a spark of anger that burned through the fog of despair. "They're coming back here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on the grip of his revolver. "Looks that way." The news of the Delaney gang's imminent return spread through Redemption Falls like wildfire, sparking fear and grim determination in equal measure. The townsfolk hadn't forgotten the bloody bank robbery 3 months ago that had left Thomas Blackwood and 2 others dead. By noon, a town meeting had been called in the small church at the end of Main Street. Elizabeth sat in the back row, keenly aware of the sympathetic glances cast her way as Sheriff Reeves addressed the gathered citizens. "We've got maybe 3 days before they arrive," Mason explained, his deep voice carrying to the rafters. "I've sent for help from the territorial marshal, but we can't count on it arriving in time. We need to prepare to defend ourselves." The mayor, a portly man with a handlebar mustache, stood up. "Last time they caught us by surprise, Sheriff. This time we'll be ready." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Elizabeth noticed the fear beneath the brave words. The Delaney gang was notorious for its brutality. 4 brothers, and their associates who left nothing but death in their wake. After the meeting dispersed, Elizabeth found herself walking alongside Martha Wilson toward the general store. The older woman had insisted that Elizabeth stay with them, rather than return to her lonely homestead outside of town, and in her current state, Elizabeth lacked the energy to argue. "The sheriff keeps looking at you," Martha observed casually, as they examined bolts of fabric. "Mason Reeves isn't a man who concerns himself with just anyone." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks despite herself. "He feels responsible for me, that's all, because of what happened yesterday." Martha raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, she said, "Did you know his wife and daughter died of influenza back in '72? Lost them both within a week of each other. The man barely spoke for a year afterward." Elizabeth glanced through the window at the sheriff, who was instructing several men on boarding up windows across the street. She hadn't known. Somehow, learning that Mason understood her pain firsthand made her feel both less alone and more exposed, as if he could see through the careful walls she'd built around her broken heart. As dusk approached, Elizabeth found herself restless in the Wilson home. Martha had retired early with a headache, and the doctor was making his evening rounds. Unable to sit still with her thoughts any longer, Elizabeth slipped out into the cool evening air, drawn inexplicably toward the sheriff's office. Through the window, she could see Mason at his desk, cleaning his revolver by lamplight, his face set in lines of concentration. She hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure of why she had come, but before she could retreat, Mason looked up and saw her. His weathered face softened slightly as he gestured for her to enter. The office smelled of gun oil, coffee, and leather, masculine scents that reminded her painfully of Thomas. "Couldn't sleep?" Mason asked, setting aside his cleaning cloth. Elizabeth shook her head, running her fingers along the edge of his desk. "I want to help," she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "When the Delaney gang comes, I want to help fight them." Mason studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It won't bring Thomas back," he finally said, his voice gentle but firm. Elizabeth lifted her chin, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I know that, but maybe it will give me a reason to wake up tomorrow. And the day after that." Her words hung in the air between them, an echo of his own offer to help her find a purpose. After what seemed like an eternity, Mason nodded slowly and stood up, crossing to a cabinet against the wall. He unlocked it and removed a polished Colt revolver, smaller than his own sidearm, but well-maintained. "This belonged to my wife," he said quietly, holding it out to her. "Sarah was a good shot. Said a woman on the frontier needed to protect herself, Elizabeth took the gun with trembling hands, feeling the weight of it, both physical and symbolic. "I don't know how to use it," she admitted. Mason's mouth curved in a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Then I'll teach you." The next morning found Elizabeth and Mason behind the livery stable, away from curious eyes. The sheriff had set up tin cans on a fence post and now stood beside Elizabeth as she raised Sarah Reeves' revolver with both hands. "Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger," Mason instructed, his voice close to her ear. "Don't pull it, just squeeze, nice and easy." Elizabeth tried to focus on the target, rather than the warmth of Mason's presence behind her, or the way his hands gently corrected her grip. When she fired, the recoil surprised her, and the bullet went wide of the mark. "Again," Mason said patiently, "you're tensing up before you fire." They spent an hour practicing, and by the end, Elizabeth had hit 3 cans, each successful shot bringing a sense of accomplishment that felt foreign after months of numbness. As they walked back toward town, Mason carrying the revolver until she would need it, Elizabeth realized she hadn't thought about the river once during their practice session. The realization both relieved and unsettled her. The Delaney gang arrived on the 3rd day, just as the sun reached its zenith in the clear blue sky. 8 riders approached from the east, dust billowing behind their horses as they made no attempt to conceal their approach. The town had been warned by a lookout, and now Main Street stood eerily empty, the citizens hidden behind barricaded doors and windows with whatever weapons they possessed. Mason stood in the middle of the street, his deputy and 3 volunteers flanking him in a line. Elizabeth watched from the window of the sheriff's office, Sarah's revolver heavy in her hand as her heart pounded against her ribs. This was the moment she had been preparing for, facing the men who had destroyed her life. Through the glass, she could see the leader of the gang, Frank Delaney, a tall man with a red beard and cold eyes. He reined his horse to a stop, 30 yards from the sheriff's position, and even from a distance, Elizabeth could see his mocking smile. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Frank Delaney called out, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "Looks like you were expecting us." Mason stood firm, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "This town's done with you, Delaney. Turn around and ride out while you still can." Frank laughed, the sound echoing off the storefronts. "Now that's not very hospitable. We just came to finish what we started at your fine bank." His eyes scanned the buildings, and Elizabeth felt a chill when his gaze passed over the sheriff's office. "Where's the pretty widow? Blackwood's wife. Thought she might like to join her husband today." At those words, something snapped inside Elizabeth. Without thinking, she pushed open the door and stepped onto the boardwalk, Sarah's revolver held at her side. She heard Mason curse under his breath, but she kept her eyes fixed on Frank Delaney, the man whose bullet had torn through Thomas's heart. Time seemed to slow as Elizabeth faced her husband's killer. Frank Delaney's eyes widened slightly in surprise before his face split in a cruel grin. "Well, well, the little widow has some spine after all." His hand moved toward his holster, and Elizabeth raised her gun, remembering Mason's lessons. Breathe out, squeeze, don't pull. The first shot rang out before anyone else could move, and Frank Delaney's hat flew from his head. Her bullet had missed him by inches, but the message was clear. The street erupted into chaos as both sides drew their weapons. Elizabeth dove for cover behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around her. Through the gun smoke, she caught glimpses of Mason exchanging fire with 2 of the gang members, his movements swift and precise. The thunder of gunshots filled the air, punctuated by shouts and the scream of a wounded horse. Elizabeth's hands were steady as she aimed and fired at a gang member attempting to flank the sheriff's position. Her bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying from his grip. There was no time to think about what she was doing, no time to question the fact that she was fighting to live, when just days ago she had been ready to die. All that mattered was protecting the town, protecting Mason, and perhaps finding some justice for Thomas in the process. She reloaded quickly, the way Mason had shown her, and risked a glance across the street where Deputy Parker was pinned down by gunfire. Without hesitation, she provided covering fire, allowing the young deputy to scramble to better cover. Their eyes met briefly, and Parker nodded his thanks before turning to fire at one of the Delaney brothers who had dismounted and was using his horse as a shield. The gunfight seemed to last an eternity, though later Elizabeth would learn it was over in less than 15 minutes. When the dust and smoke finally began to clear, 3 of the Delaney gang lay dead in the street. 2 more were wounded and secured, and the remaining 3, including Frank Delaney himself, had retreated, galloping out of town with the sheriff's bullets following them. Elizabeth slumped against the water trough, suddenly aware of a burning pain in her upper arm, where a bullet had grazed her. Mason appeared at her side, his face streaked with sweat and gunpowder. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough as he examined her wound. Elizabeth shook her head. "It's nothing." She looked up at him, searching his face for injuries. Finding none, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by guilt. What right did she have to feel relieved when Thomas was still dead? What right did she have to care whether Sheriff Mason Reeves lived or died? As Doc Wilson tended to her wound that evening, Elizabeth sat in silence, trying to make sense of the tumultuous emotions coursing through her. The exhilaration of the fight had faded, leaving her exhausted but strangely clear-headed. Thomas was still gone, and that pain would never truly leave her. But today, she had found something she thought was lost forever: the will to fight, to live, to feel something other than despair. When the doctor finished bandaging her arm, he patted her hand gently. "You did well today, Mrs. Blackwood. The whole town's talking about how you stood up to Frank Delaney." Elizabeth managed a small smile. "I missed," Doc Wilson chuckled. "Maybe, but you showed him, and yourself, that you're not beaten yet." As he packed away his supplies, he added casually, "Sheriff's outside. Been pacing the porch for the past hour, waiting to see you. Shall I send him in?" Mason's face was solemn when he entered the room, his hat in his hands. He stood awkwardly for a moment before taking the seat the doctor had vacated. "That was a damn fool thing you did today," he said, though there was no real anger in his voice. "Standing out in the open like that." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "I needed Frank Delaney to see me, to know that I wasn't hiding from him." Mason nodded slowly, understanding in his gray eyes. "3 months ago, I couldn't save your husband," he said, his voice low. "When I pulled you from the river, I was afraid I was too late again." He hesitated, then reached out and took her hand in his calloused one. "I'm glad I wasn't." Elizabeth looked down at their joined hands, feeling the strength in his grip and the gentle way his thumb moved across her knuckles. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not letting me drown, in the river or in my grief." 2 days later, a territorial marshal arrived with a posse to take custody of the captured Delaney gang members and to organize a search for the escaped brothers. The town of Redemption Falls slowly returned to normal, the damaged buildings repaired and the bullet holes in the storefronts patched over. Elizabeth, her arm healing well, found herself at a crossroads. Her small homestead outside of town sat empty, a place filled with memories both beautiful and painful. She stood on the porch of the Wilson home, watching as Mason spoke with the marshal across the street, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. In the past week, he had become a constant in her life, teaching her to shoot, standing beside her during the gunfight, visiting her each day as she recovered. She wasn't ready to call what she felt for him love. That would be a betrayal of Thomas's memory. But there was something there, a connection, forged in shared pain and mutual understanding, that made her heart beat a little faster when he was near. "Leaving town?" Mason asked, finding Elizabeth at the stagecoach office later that afternoon. She shook her head, turning from the posted schedule to face him. "No, just wondering what it would be like. To start fresh somewhere else." Mason studied her face, his expression guarded. "And what did you decide?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, meeting his eyes. "That running away won't help me heal. That maybe I need to stay and face the memories, the good and the bad." A small smile tugged at the corner of Mason's mouth. "I'm glad to hear it. Redemption Falls wouldn't be the same without you, Mrs. Blackwood." There was something in his tone that made her brave enough to say, "I think after everything we've been through, you might call me Elizabeth." His smile widened slightly, warming his usually stern features. "Elizabeth, then. And I'm Mason, not Sheriff, when we're not on official business." As summer gave way to autumn, Elizabeth found herself spending more time in town than at her homestead. She began helping Martha Wilson with her seamstress work, discovering that she had a talent for the intricate stitching of fine dresses. The routine and purpose of the work helped fill the empty hours, and the companionship of the older woman provided comfort without intrusion. Mason became a regular visitor at the Wilson home, often bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers gathered during his rounds, a piece of ribbon for her hair. They never spoke directly of what had happened at the river or of the feelings growing between them. There was an unspoken agreement that some things needed time, that hearts as damaged as theirs required patience to heal. But each day, Elizabeth found it a little easier to smile, to laugh, to imagine a future that didn't end at the bottom of the Missouri River. The news came with the first snow of winter. Frank Delaney and his remaining brother had been killed in a shootout with lawmen near the Montana border. Mason brought the telegram to Elizabeth himself, watching her face carefully as she read the words that confirmed her husband's killers would never threaten anyone again. She folded the paper neatly, her hands steady. "It's over then," she said quietly. Mason nodded, removing his hat as snowflakes melted on its brim. "It's over." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow fall gently outside the window. Then Mason cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tonight. To celebrate, if that's the right word." Elizabeth considered the invitation, aware of what it might mean. A step beyond friendship, a public acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them. Thomas would always be her first love, the man who had shown her what it meant to be cherished. But perhaps there was room in her heart for another chapter, another kind of love born from shared pain and mutual healing. As they walked through the snowy streets that evening, Mason offered Elizabeth his arm, and she took it without hesitation. The townspeople they passed nodded respectfully, some smiling knowingly at the sight of the stern sheriff and the widow walking arm in arm. Elizabeth no longer cared about their whispers or judgments. She had earned the right to seek happiness wherever she might find it. When they reached the river on their way back from dinner, Elizabeth paused, looking out at the dark water, now partially frozen at the edges. Mason stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "I come here sometimes," she admitted softly, "to remember, but not to join him. Not anymore." Mason's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her own. "I'm glad," he said simply. The pain was still there. It always would be. But now it existed alongside hope, possibility, and the warmth of Mason's hand in hers as they stood together, watching the river flow onward beneath the winter stars. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.